Hello everybody, welcome to today's webinar. SDN Market Disruption is underway with TBR Data Center Analyst, Krista Macomber, and Principal Analyst, Christian Perry, who will be conducting our Q&A today. I'm Justin Surgent, and I'm hosting today's session. Insights from today's presentation are shared from TBR's SDN market landscape. If you'd like to learn more about this research, please reach out to myself or one of the analysts after the presentation. And before we begin, there are a few housekeeping items I'd like to cover. First, I'll be recording today's session and posting it to our YouTube site, TBRI channel. We encourage you to visit this channel to watch this presentation or any of the previous presentations we've posted. Second, I'll be following up with all of you via email tomorrow afternoon with the link to today's recording as well as with the slides from today's presentation, so please be on the lookout for that. And finally, we do welcome questions on what we're presenting today. Please send any questions you have to the Q&A function, preferably that over the chat function, as it's easier for us to sort through on our end here. And we will address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Now with that, I'd like to hand this over to Krista.
All right, great. Thanks very much, Justin, and welcome to all of our attendees today. As Justin mentioned, we're going to be taking a look at the enterprise SDN market today. And what we're seeing in this market is that it remains in a period of maturity, and we're looking at that from the standpoint of technology development, and we're also looking at this from the standpoint of customer adoption as well. But one thing is very clear, and that's that enterprise SDN is here to stay. We're seeing that as customers increasingly begin to deploy SDN architectures in production deployments, it's solving some very pressing IT headaches for customers. And we'll get into that in more detail during the conversation today. That being said, so we do believe that SDN will coexist alongside more traditional switch and router deployments, but as customers increasingly shift more to SDN architectures, we do believe that this will increasingly disrupt not only revenue and growth opportunities in the space, but also the vendor landscape. We believe that the vendor landscape is going to become more splintered. We believe that software-centric vendors will have an inroad to really gain share from hardware-centric vendors. And as a result of this, we believe it's very critical for enterprise networking vendors to have viable SDN businesses from a long-term perspective. We'll frame this through three lenses during today's discussion, the first being the impacts that we see SDN having on the enterprise market today. The second being more from the standpoint of customer adoption. What is adoption looking like today? What are the drivers and inhibitors of adoption? And also, where do we expect that to go going forward? And then finally, as well, how we see vendors responding from the standpoint of go-to-market, resource management, portfolio development, alliances and acquisitions as well. And so with that, let's jump in. CVR estimates that the enterprise SDN market will grow at an 86% CAGR from 2014 to 2019, and this compares to just a 2% CAGR for the overall global enterprise network infrastructure market. I mentioned that SDN is here to stay and that revenue will increasingly shift to SDN, and you can see on the chart here that we believe SDN will grow to a $10 billion market by 2019, or 30% of the overall enterprise network infrastructure marketplace as a whole. So certainly growing to a substantial revenue contributor in the market. We see that vendors are contributing to this overall CAGR, or I guess I should say we expect that they will be contributing to the overall CAGR. We're seeing that they have begun to really evolve their business models. We're seeing that vendors are transforming to better meet evolving customer requirements, and that SDN is a big piece of this strategy, a very significant piece of this strategy. I mentioned that the vendor share will become much more splintered in the market, and what we believe will happen is that as traditional hardware vendors such as Cisco face slowing revenue growth in more traditional hardware streams, and also more incrementally growing revenue streams from a software standpoint, we believe that their overall growth will begin to slow. And meanwhile, we believe that niche and more software-centric vendors will gain market share by really capitalizing on the increasing abstraction of functionality into software and also customers' requirements for more heterogeneous hardware support. We believe that during this time frame outlined here, that trial deployments will continue to increase across customers' environments, which will lead to production deployments. And as a result, we do believe that year-to-year revenue growth for enterprise SDN will remain at or above 100% year-to-year through the majority of this forecast period. We expect that in 2018, growth will begin to slow down. It will begin to decelerate as the market gains scale and begins to approach maturity. And so taking a little bit of a closer look now at how the market is developing. From a technology standpoint, we saw that traditional network standards were driven by a smaller number of large vendors, Cisco, of course, being a very key contributor here. But when we look at the SDN market, we see that openness and really a focus on collaboration and more of an ecosystem-driven approach to innovation is needed. We're seeing that vendors really need to rely on this type of approach to be able to not only both quickly and cost-effectively pull together their SDN solutions, but also comprehensively doing so as well. As a result, we've seen a number of industry alliance initiatives start up and then also continue to gain momentum in the marketplace. The Open Networking Foundation naturally is one of the most significant that comes to mind, but we're also seeing other more vendor-driven initiatives such as Dell's Open Networking Initiative come into play as well. And we're seeing that these are being formulated so that vendors can not only attract additional partners to their ecosystem, but also really tap their particular areas of expertise. For example, in the part of Dell working closely with Big Switch Networks and Cumulus Networks as well to tap some of that more niche innovation. We're also seeing an increasing support of open source technologies, for example, such as those provided by Puppet Labs for application orchestration, again, to really round out these solutions and be able to introduce more advanced or more enterprise class functionality. And as the market continues to develop, we're seeing that the use cases they're broadening, and we're seeing that they're also shifting to more mission-critical use cases as well. So, for example, we're seeing that oftentimes in trial deployments, customers may focus on things like automation that are less mission-critical. But as the technology, as trial deployments continue to increase, we're seeing that they're also shifting to areas like security. This is a big focus for VMware with its NSX platform, and also for mission-critical application availability that can really make a difference in customers' environments. From a go-to-market standpoint, we're seeing that the customers are not yet convinced fully on the SDN architecture, so we're seeing that conversations right now are still very focused on the speeds and feeds of the technologies themselves. Customers want to know that the technologies are going to be usable. They want to know that they're going to be able to be integrated easily into their existing infrastructure, and also that the architecture is going to be able to bring value to the table in terms of being able to solve their pain points. And as a result, we're seeing that vendors are, they're talking about these things, for example, helping customers to increase the scalability of their IT services. And for vendors, this means not only training their direct sales staff on their new SDN architectures and the value propositions behind them, but also working closely with channel partners to help these channel partners build SDN practices. So we're seeing, for example, hands-on training be a big focus to help, hands-on training in terms of areas like application development to help partners get really first-hand experience in terms of, using these technologies and then helping the end customer, implement and really get value from these solutions. From a resource management perspective, I mentioned that SDN adoption is going to be incremental. And so what we believe is going to happen is that the monetization of these solutions for vendors is going to be a slower burn over the next 3 to 5 years. And so what that means is that vendors will need to place very smart bets from the standpoint of their investments. And this is actually across the spectrum of vendors that we track within the SDN marketplace. For the larger, more incumbent vendors, we're seeing that they're having to shift their resources from a portfolio and a go-to-market standpoint towards SDN really at a faster pace than they're actually gaining their revenue back. So in order to be able to, really drive towards operating profitability and things like that with these solutions, we definitely believe that there's going to be a big focus going forward on increasing the monetization of these solutions. And from the standpoint of the smaller vendors, the more niche vendors, this becomes an even greater challenge because these vendors have even fewer resources to work with. So what we're seeing is that vendors like Big Switch are partnering with larger vendors, for example, in that example, Dell, to be able to gain additional scale, additional support from a go-to-market standpoint that they can use to further the proof of concept of their solutions and really spark adoption in the industry. And also for the niche vendors, we're also seeing a continued focus on gaining the venture funding that we have seen over the past about 3 or 4 years now. We are seeing a continued focus on that from these niche vendors to be able to further their portfolio development and even launch, for example, some channel programs to, again, drive adoption of their solutions. So with that being said, I would like to take a closer look at customer adoption trends in the industry. We mentioned that adoption will be incremental going forward, and we don't believe that customers are really wholesale migrating over to SDN solutions. And a key piece that we believe is holding back acceleration of adoption is disruption. And this is disruption from 2 different standpoints. The first being a disruption to traditional technology deployments. SDN is a very radical departure from the more hardware-centric way of doing networking that customers are used to. And beginning to trust the architecture with, or the thought of trusting the architecture with mission-critical deployments is a big risk for customers. But this is also disruption not only to technology, but also to ways of doing business. Network administrators have a fear that their jobs are going to become less critical as more of the functions that they used to do become, abstracted into software through SDN. This perception does exist, but it isn't necessarily the reality, we believe. We believe that, in fact, SDN makes the network administrator's jobs even more critical because it makes their job more tied to serving business requirements and enabling business outcomes, so even more strategic from that standpoint. Over the next 12 months, we believe that production deployments among initial adopters will increase, and that from a longer-term perspective over the next 4 years, solutions and standards will begin to mature, which will spur an uptick and broader adoption as well across the industry. And this will not only be those technology solutions and standards, but also the increasing business validation in the later portion of that time period as well. That all being said, we believe that the disruption we mentioned will prevent mainstream adoption before 2020. We are seeing that large enterprises primarily are early adopters of SDN solutions, and we believe this is because these customers have greater flexibility to segment pieces of their network and deploy SDN solutions on a trial basis, or even deploy SDN in smaller branch or remote offices as well, to really kick the tires with the solutions and begin to drive towards that validation. This is also because these customers have greater CapEx, greater investment leverage as well to be able to trial out newer architectures. Well, we believe as well that currently from a geographical perspective, adoption is strongest in the U.S., and this is because many of the leading SDN vendors, for example, Cisco and VMware, have their largest install bases in the U.S., so this has provided a large existing customer base to begin to transition to SDN, and also strong access as well for the customers of the solutions as well. What also is interesting as well that we're seeing in the Americas is that we're also seeing in Latin America customers are earlier adopters of SDN as well, because they're looking at the solutions in verticals like education, government, banking to really increase their agility and their connectivity as well. Another piece that we believe will slow enterprise SDN adoption over the next 5 years is that customers are seeking to maximize their existing infrastructure investments. And this is actually part of why we believe they're deploying SDN, which is to extend the life cycles of their hardware and really maximize that investment. So we're seeing that they're beginning to trial some overlay or built-in software capabilities And also for net new build-outs or for hardware upgrades as well, we're seeing that SDN is getting an increasing piece of that investment. So that's really how we believe SDN is going to continue to be adopted over the next 4 to 5 years. And we believe that this is going to result in environments for customers that are really hybrid between traditional and software-defined technologies. One final comment I did want to make before we move ahead to the next slide is that we do believe extra licensing costs as well. For example, Cisco's ACI controller are causing customers to hold off on production deployments. Again, they really want to try to control their budgets, maximize their existing investments as well. And so this customer, I guess, hesitancy or skepticism in terms of wanting to fully validate the architecture is the key inhibitor that we're seeing in terms of inhibiting, I guess, adoption of SDN architectures. So for vendors, what we believe this means in the near term is that they must work with customers, IT decision makers, very closely around continued advancement of industry standards, also the enterprise class reliability, really, of their solutions to drive that initial adoption. So for example, we're seeing that they're messaging the improved reliability and scalability of IT services that can be enabled through SDN. And increasingly, that will begin to facilitate those business-driven conversations and business validation as customers rely on the architecture more for mission-critical workloads. And this does actually parallel some general industry trends that we're seeing in other accelerating pieces of the infrastructure market. We saw it, for example, with cloud, and we are seeing this with the software-defined data center as well. We do see these parallels both on the inhibitors and also on, both on the drivers, I should say, and also on the inhibitors as well. A couple of other things I wanted to point out that we believe is causing this slower burn to SDN adoption. One piece is the lack of previously vetted deployed use cases. It's difficult for vendors to make the case for the value and the reliability of their solutions if there are only a few previous examples set. Also, standards are still being built around SDN, and so this adds to the perception of risk, really, for the technology, the architecture as well. Internal resistance to change is something that we keep coming back to. People are very set in their ways, and this is very difficult to change, and it's really, again, one of the key inhibitors that we're seeing to adoption today. And this is playing out in a couple of different ways, and one way that I did want to call out is the conflict in decision-making between networking and server teams. We're seeing that, functionality, for example, such as management, gets a little less clear, a little more coagulated underneath SDN. It becomes a little unclear where this management falls. And so for vendors, helping customers to figure these things out and really have a clear path to their SDN deployment and actually using the technology day-to-day will be helpful in terms of driving adoption. And the last section before we do shift to take your questions, we'd like to dig more deeply into the vendor landscape. Before we get into the vendor specifics, I wanted to just at a high level lay out the two key classes of vendors that we do track here at TBR that we've seen emerge in the marketplace. The first is those vendors that provide solely overlay deployment software. These pieces of software can be deployed across existing hardware deployments. They are truly vendor agnostic, and we're seeing that these platforms help to automate, centralize, and also abstract functionality, for example, such as orchestration, management, provisioning as well. And the key for these vendors is really simplicity for customers and also reduced CapEx. And on the next slide, we'll talk about how these vendors are leveraging that value proposition to begin to gain some clout in the industry. The second approach that we see in the market is that of an SDN controller deployed with optimized hardware. This is the approach that we see brought to market by vendors, for example, like Cisco, Juniper, Brocade. And although Although some of these controllers may also be overlays, and we do see a shift from these vendors in terms of increasing their support of heterogeneous hardware support and also of more abstraction of functionality into the software layer. At the end of the day, these controllers are truly optimized to work best with these vendors' hardware. We're seeing that these vendors are also shifting their architectures as well to be a bit more programmable, a bit more industry standard as well, and that they're bringing to the market this message of the value of not only optimizing the overlay piece of the SDN architecture, but also the underlying physical connections and workloads as well. So from the standpoint of the software vendors, I mentioned that these vendors are positioning for really as an avenue to reduce CapEx for customers. And this is really at the hardware layer. So we're seeing that these software vendors are messaging to customers the reduced need to purchase new hardware, the reduced need to upgrade their existing hardware, and also the reduced need for really complex, more expensive hardware as well. Also, the complexity, the management complexity piece is key as well, and so we're seeing that these messages are really beginning to resonate with customers, and they're helping to provide these vendors with an inroad into customers' environments. But that being said, customers are not used to working with these vendors for their networking functionality. This is even true for the larger vendors in the space, with VMware being naturally the biggest vendor and the most established vendor, really the biggest vendor in the space currently. And so what this means for these vendors is that they have to ensure to continue to really focus on messaging the reliability of their architecture, the value, the reliability of their roadmap and the support as well, to be able to continue to gain share in the marketplace. We're seeing these vendors go about this in a couple of different ways. VMware is the first use case that comes to mind. As VMware first really made its foray into the SDN marketplace following its acquisition of Nicira back in 2012, it positioned the NSX platform more as a feature-driven extension of vSphere, and that's, of course, its core server virtualization platform. So really building from that traction in server virtualization to begin to spark some adoption of NSX. But we're seeing that strategy and that message is really evolving and maturing for VMware. I mentioned earlier on in the discussion that security is a big focus for VMware with NSX. What we're seeing is that VMware continues to develop the microsegmentation capabilities within NSX and also really focuses messaging here as well. And so from that standpoint, we're seeing that VMware is focusing on what we believe is a very pressing pain point for customers. We're seeing that the network is becoming very porous as customers are adopting mobile computing and introducing cloud assets into their environment as well, and so it's a big concern for customers. So the more that VMware can really emphasize capabilities like security and use cases, also like security, I should say as well, with NSX, we believe that it will help VMware to continue to grow in the enterprise SDN market. And a slightly different approach, Big Switch Networks is working with a number of partners. Dell, Mirantis, and Facebook are three recent partners Big Switch works with to build a reference architecture for its SDN solutions. And so from that standpoint, Big Switch is not only continuing innovation, it's often seen as really a pioneer in the space, a really early entrant to the space and an innovator. So it's continuing with that value proposition, that differentiator, but it's also working with some larger peers to further build that proof of concept that we've been talking about, again, with the support of its partners. And the hardware-centric vendors, as I mentioned, are taking a bit of a different approach. The data center market as a whole, and the enterprise network landscape included, is really shifting towards more industry-standard hardware with really software-driven functionality. And this is certainly true. SDN, we believe, is further accelerating this shift. And that's a threat to these hardware-centric vendors because, as I mentioned on the previous slide, it does create inroads for new competitors into the market. So we're seeing And I mentioned a couple slides ago that we are seeing these vendors increase their investment in their support of open source technologies, begin to move towards more of a heterogeneous hardware support, more heterogeneous hardware support capabilities. But at the end of the day, what's really core to the value proposition that they're bringing to the marketplace is messaging that value of end-to-end optimization. So they're playing to their roots in networking expertise and innovation, and they're talking about, really the increased reliability, performance, availability that customers can gain as a result of a truly optimized hardware and software stack. And a couple of key case studies do come to mind when we talk about this, Cisco being the first one. What we've seen is that Cisco has built its SDN controller and capabilities, application-centric infrastructure is what it calls. Cisco has built ACI into its Nexus switches, and we've seen that Cisco has really built a lot of initial adoption, and also it's built a lot of initial awareness and adoption. It talks about continued growth rates to its Nexus switch line in the triple digits, and so that's a really smart move, we believe, because as Cisco's customers have come up for hardware refresh, we're seeing that Cisco's been able to position as a really logical choice for these vendors in terms of adopting more of an SDN architecture. So we're also seeing that, so as I mentioned, some of these ACI capabilities may not be, fully turned on by customers yet in their environments. So the next step for Cisco is really to continue to spark adoption of the ACI capabilities. So that's not only with working with customers around the increased value that they'll gain from turning on these capabilities, but also continuing to drive innovation into portfolio. As I mentioned, continuing to support those open, more heterogeneous capabilities as well. From the standpoint of Juniper is also, working to message that hardware software optimization. And we're seeing that also really core to Juniper's strategy is broadening its customer base. And we're seeing that Juniper is actually having success in very large multinational enterprise accounts. And what it's doing is it's building more architectures or solutions as a point-to-point products with many of its SDN capabilities really at the core. And we're seeing that strategy has really been successful for Juniper as customers begin to purchase with more of a focus on projects and workloads and those business outcomes as opposed to point products. So I've mentioned a lot about where vendors are investing in terms of their innovation. And we're seeing that they continue to roll out new capabilities, for example, enhanced provisioning, enhanced upgrades. But we do believe that alliances and acquisitions will continue to be strategic avenues for vendors to augment their capabilities. From the standpoint of acquisitions, we believe that these acquisitions will become more targeted, for example, in areas such as the network operating system through perhaps an acquisition of Cumulus Networks. And we're also seeing that vendors are working to, as I mentioned, really drive broader alliances in the industry. And yesterday's news about the alliance between Cisco and Ericsson certainly does come to mind when we talk about this. This is actually a great example of the impact that we see these shifting competitive dynamics in the industry having on very large incumbent players in the marketplace. So Cisco and Ericsson aligning to fill really strategic gaps in each other's strategies, and we believe that this alliance will have a stronger focus in the near term on the telco sector, but we believe that these vendors, as they're able to potentially rationalize different areas of their portfolios and really formulate a really complementary go-to-market approach, we believe that will be very significant in helping to expand proof of concept for these vendors that will help them to also gain SDN adoption within the enterprise. And with that actually concludes the remarks that we had prepared today, and we would love to take your questions.
So as a reminder, this is Christian Perry. I'll be the host of your Q&A session today. As a reminder, you can submit questions using the Q&A function at the top of the WebEx window. The first question, how is it difficult to establish a business case? I thought that one of the main things about SDN is that it saves money from having to buy expensive hardware. That seems like it would be a very straightforward case to articulate.
Sure. So when we're looking at this, and so yes, saving CapEx for customers is certainly a very strong value proposition. But as I mentioned, there are some hurdles that also need to be worked through before I think customers get there in terms of the validation. So I mentioned that SDN is a new architecture, so that does make it risky from the standpoint of the industry standards are still being developed, vendors are still filling out their portfolios. And so first, they need to know that the technology is going to work and work well within their environment. And that does remain a very IT-centric conversation naturally. And so as that adoption begins to expand, that's when the further differentiation comes in around areas, for example, such as business agility. So a couple of use cases then, and we didn't get a chance to really flesh this out on the webinar, but there are some use cases that we're seeing evolve around SDN, for example, around enabling more dynamic connectivity across customers' data centers and also with public cloud assets as well. And so that's kind of where the business use cases come in above and beyond just saving money at the end of the day, because that leads to even greater opportunities for the business as they're able to be more agile.
Next question, wondering how you see software-defined compute, storage, and network as a whole evolve over time. Do you see them following a different trajectory or adopt it as a converged solution? And I can address this first, Krista, and if you'd like to add, please feel free to. So when we look at the various components of what we might call a software-defined data center, server, storage, networking, in these nascent stages, in the early days, we do see them all following different trajectories, and I think that's sort of the nature of the beast, because there is such a massive footprint of traditional standalone hardware that it's difficult to see any cohesive effort across a software-defined ecosystem going in, unless it's a greenfield data center. But even there, the platforms just are not mature enough. And we had a webinar on software-defined storage yesterday, and we talked about that. Yes, the value proposition is definitely there. It's there. It's fully established for server virtualization and software-defined compute, if you will. But it's not, the market is not mature enough, not on the enterprise side for networking, not for storage. So again, we still see these things being deployed on a very workload by especially in storage, workload by workload basis. Now, with that said, there is something happening, and you did mention it here, with converged solutions, and especially hyper-converged, which we view as an easy on-ramp to two things: virtualization for businesses that have not yet fully virtualized or even approached full virtualization of their ecosystems, and B, an easy on-ramp to software-defined storage. And the networking play isn't, it doesn't quite play out as much when we look at SDN and SDN across an environment when you're looking at converged. However, if you do have a fully converged environment, then you could theoretically have all the pieces of a software-defined data center. But what's interesting here with hyperconverged, we see these platforms right now being driven primarily into SMB and organizations in the lower end of the mid-market. These are organizations without a huge environment, or a huge footprint, rather, of architecture. So it does become easier to approach that whole software-defined data center concept if they do, over time, in a short in short order, perhaps, deploy a lot of hyperconverged or even converged. But for the time being, when we look at the overall enterprise market, yeah, we are going to see these things take different trajectories until we do see more formalization around standards. That's key. That's really key, especially in software-defined storage. And then vendor support around whichever standard or standards win, and then maturity around those solutions. Once that happens, then we can see things kind of gelling and coming together. Anything to add, Krista?
No, that covered it. Thank you, Christian.
Sure. Next question. You touched on adoption in the Americas. Any insights on rest of world?
Sure, certainly. So I guess starting with EMEA, we're seeing that budgets in EMEA overall do remain very tight. So that drives customers, we believe, to focus more on maintaining their infrastructure. We believe it focuses them to focus more on, they're spending more on more mature technologies as opposed to SDN. So that being said, we do believe that initial adoption in EMEA right now is occurring in very large, more mature countries, for example, like Germany and the UK, where there's a little more, I guess, flexibility from that standpoint. And then also from the standpoint of APAC, what's interesting here, what we believe is happening is we believe that service providers in APAC have quickly adopted SDN and NFV technologies. And so we believe that that has actually had the impact of dampening adoption of SDN among enterprises, because enterprises, we believe, are then more incentivized to shift more of their workloads onto public cloud resources provided by those service providers. So that being said, so that's a general trend we're seeing in terms of countries specifically. We believe that in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, we believe that there's a bit more network maturity, and so that would spur these customers to have more flexibility to trial SDN earlier. And we also are seeing in China that there's a big push towards more open, more software-defined architectures, and we've also seen very heavy investment overall from vendors, for example, such as Dell and Cisco recently. And so all of that, we believe, will also is also causing China to be an earlier adopter of SDN.
Thank you. Next question. What are some of the risks you see with the Cisco-Ericsson alliance?
Sure, certainly. It's a great question. I'm sure it's top of mind for many folks following the news yesterday. I touched briefly in the presentation on the fact that these vendors do have competing offerings. So I guess first, taking a step back, we believe that the alliance overall is very complementary, and we can certainly see the logic behind really, meshing Ericsson's systems integration, managed services competencies with Cisco's more product-focused background. But there is still some portfolio overlap in areas, in important areas, actually, for example, like network control and areas like Wi-Fi. So we think that that's going to be one of the biggest things for the two vendors to sort out, if this alliance is truly going to continue to be very strategic for both vendors. And that's going to be difficult because, as opposed to if the two companies if one had been acquired by the other and they were becoming integrated, it may be easier for the companies to sort of, pick one piece of the portfolio and focus their efforts there. But naturally, both vendors are still going to be incentivized to continue to compete in these markets. So we'll be watching how those different areas of the portfolio are rationalized. And another couple comments. One, I think, is the sense of urgency. So I touched during the discussion on we view this as certainly a response to evolving competitive dynamics. And so part of that is actions taken by these vendors' competitors, and I'm referring, primarily to the Alcatel-Lucent Nokia integration that's coming up. But it's also, I think, the pace at which customer expectations are changing and the pace at which customers are shifting to look at these newer types of architectures. And so on one hand, I think that drives Cisco and Ericsson to want to make sure that they execute very cleanly, not only on the the solution development and some of the portfolio rationalization that I mentioned, but also from the standpoint of making sure that they're able to build go-to-market initiatives that are complementary, that are clear for both companies. But it also, at the same time, it incentivizes them to move more quickly as well. So that could also create the risk of some missteps from that standpoint as they're working to quickly move forward with the alliance. And this requires big organizational shifts. I mean, this scale of joint development initiatives, building those streamlined and clear go-to-market initiatives, that's a big endeavor for these companies. So again, balancing, I think, the sense of urgency with wanting to make sure that they're able to sort all these things out will be important for both vendors.
Thanks, Krista. Next question. Would you say that converged or hyperconverged implies, quote, software-defined, or does the definition of convergence not include the use of software to fulfill server, storage, and network functions? Yeah, that's what we're seeing to this point. When we take a look at the technology from the first standpoint, the hyperconverged platforms and the ultimate solution, whether it's deployed, as a software platform on existing hardware or it's deployed from an appliance delivery model, these are typically fully virtualized. And because they're fully virtualized, and then we have other, storage-centric capabilities built in often, such as inline dedupe and compression and cloud gateways. There's a very heavy sort of software-defined element in there around storage management. So even because these are deployed in most cases for a particular workload or a small set of workloads, say VDI or video surveillance or traditional virtualized workloads such as Exchange, SQL Server, Oracle, yes, that we would call that deployment of that infrastructure for that workload, we would say, and customers are recognizing it as software-defined in that confined deployment. Converged, although our definition of converged must include that management software, that management layer, software layer, as part of the compute, storage, and networking. So yeah, it must be there. That whole software management must be there to control those hardware infrastructure functions. But it's not generally considered by us or by the market as something that's software defined. But you could look at this 100 different ways, because we could argue that infrastructure and the management of infrastructure has been software defined for decades, but it's different levels of that software definition around the management. But when we look at what's quickly becoming the classic definition of software defined, where the software layer is abstracted from the hardware, truly abstracted, that's not something that we would look to, a traditional converged infrastructure or converged system as a representative of that definition. So something like a VBlock, and we know that customers aren't saying, oh, we want a VBlock because we want software defined in our environment. No, they want something that's easy to purchase, easy to deploy, easy to manage, and reliable performance for a particular workload or a set of workloads. Next question. Do you see SDN included in converged and hyperconverged private cloud solutions being a scalable initial adoption point for large enterprise? That's a really interesting question and a really interesting idea. And I think that, yes, indeed, it depends on the size of the deployment. If we're talking large enterprise here, I think if we actually look at if we look at hyperscale, for example, and if things were built into hyperscale, you know, in talking SDN, built into a hyperscale deployment in the enterprise, or what we might call the sub-hyperscale market, you know, where we see hyperscale-like implementations going into oil and gas or research or other fields like that. Absolutely, I think that that could be a tremendous opportunity to build out from there, you know, those SDN functions, because that, you know, that sort of efficiency and ease of management is necessary in any large deployment. Now, with converged and hyper-converged, I'm not so sure what the size of the opportunity is there, because these are, I'm just talking converged, not hyper-converged. These tend to be very pricey solutions that aren't often purchased in bulk. They're purchased, you know, one at a time or a few at a time over time. And yeah, that, you know, that is scalable. It's an initial adoption point. I'm just not sure what the size of that opportunity is. However, we often see, we study this market a lot, we see converged systems being deployed for an emerging workload in a large enterprise, and they still have a huge outlay of traditional architecture. Now that, I think, is where that initial adoption point, it absolutely could begin with converged. And if a vendor can figure out how to hop over from converged, you know, in terms of, you know, scaling out those SDN capabilities from converged over into the rest of the existing environment, yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there. Hyper-converged is a little different because of the type of environments we see these going into. They tend to be smaller, and, you know, with the idea that they're going to help businesses grow, and that's the idea we would hope of any infrastructure going into any environment, but there's a real business case we see behind hyperconverged because of the cost savings and you know, the streamlined management, you know, both CapEx and OpEx savings here. If businesses do grow as a result of hyperconverged, they're going to buy more hyperconverged, and there's definitely an opportunity there. Next question, would you agree that SDN applies more to horizontal scale systems than vertical scale systems?
Sure, this is Kristen. I think that's actually a great segue from the comments that Christian was just making. I think overall, and I think certainly right now. So we talked during the presentation on how we believe that adoption is beginning in large enterprises, and I talked about the fact that essentially these customers have more flexibility to kick the tires with the solutions. But I also think that they have a greater, you know, they have a more complex networking environment naturally, and they have a greater need to simplify that as a result. And I think that, you know, certainly to the comments that Christian was making around, you know, in terms of, you know, some of the opportunity being a little more, you know, maybe more focused or more limited right now as we look at more vertically focused stacks, for example, such as Converged. But I think naturally as those grow as Converged and hyper-converged as examples of this more vertically focused approach continue to expand across customers' environments, I think that then there could be, you know, from a longer term perspective, some opportunity there to leverage these SDN capabilities for, as we mentioned, more centralization, automation, you know, and overall, in general, less complexity in the environment.
And Justin, that looks like the last question in the queue.
All right, well, excuse me. Thank you, Krista and Christian, and thank you everybody for sending in your questions and for attending today's webinar. You can follow our analysts as well as TBR on Twitter. Their handles listed here, and please check out our social media pages on SlideShare and YouTube to view our previously aired webinars. Additionally, before you sign off, I'd like to ask you to take a very brief survey on what we presented today. We're always looking to improve both the information we provide and how we provide it. And a reminder, I will be following up with everyone via email tomorrow afternoon with the recording link as well as the slides from today's session. So I'll leave the chat function open for another minute or so for people to ask any last-minute questions. Otherwise, thanks for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.